The morning of the auction, there were 41 goats nobody wanted. They stood crowded in the last pen at the back of the Kettle Creek stockyard, the pen farthest from the loading chutes, the one the yardmen used for animals they expected to send to the renderer by afternoon. The drought had been on the valley for 2 years by then, and the grass had gone the color of old paper, and these 41 animals looked like the drought itself had walked into a body and set up housekeeping. Their ribs showed. Their coats had gone dull and patchy. A few of them leaned against the rails because standing straight had become a negotiation they were losing. The man who owned them, a hog farmer named Del Prater, who had taken them in trade for a debt and regretted it every day since, stood at the front with his cap pushed back, telling anyone who would listen that he'd sell the whole lot for whatever a body would pay just to be shut of them. The auctioneer didn't even bother with his sing-song. He looked at the pen, looked at the thin crowd of men leaning on the top rail, and said the opening was $1 and let the silence sit. That was when the girl raised her hand. She was maybe 22, in a canvas jacket 2 sizes too big, and boots that had belonged to somebody with larger feet, and she had been standing at the edge of the crowd for the better part of an hour without saying a word to anyone. She had simply looked at the goats, looked at them the way you might read a letter you weren't sure you understood, going back over the lines. When she raised her hand, a few of the men laughed, not cruelly, just the easy laugh of people watching somebody make a mistake they were glad not to be making. The auctioneer squinted at her and said, $1? Do I hear 2? And a feed store regular named Warren Coyle called out, from behind his coffee, that she ought to save her dollar and buy something that would still be breathing come Sunday. The laughter went around again. The girl kept her hand up. Nobody raised against her. The auctioneer said sold, $4 for the pen, which came to less than 10 cents an animal, and Warren Coyle said, loud enough to carry, that she'd overpaid. If you have ever been told that what you have isn't worth much, that the thing you love or the place you come from or the work you do doesn't add up to anything, then this story is for you. And I'd ask you to do 2 small things before we go on. Tap the like button, because it genuinely helps this little channel reach other people who need to hear it. And leave a comment telling me the name of your town, your city, wherever you are in the world right now, because I read every single one and I like knowing who's out there listening in the quiet. Now, let's begin. Her name was Junie Halloran, and she had come back to the valley in March, 3 weeks before the auction, not because she had a plan, but because there was nowhere else that was hers. Her great-aunt Odile had died in February, alone in the farmhouse at the end of Sorrel Road, and had left the place to Junie for reasons nobody in the family could fully explain, since Junie had only visited a handful of times as a child. The rest of the Hallorans had spread themselves thin across 3 states and had opinions about the farm but no desire to live on it. It was 80 acres of hillside pasture and creek bottom, most of it too steep to plow, with a house that needed a roof and a barn that leaned a degree or 2 off true, and a spring that ran clean even in the drought when the shallow wells around it had gone to mud. Junie had driven up from the city in a truck that made a sound in 3rd gear like it was composing its own obituary, and she had let herself into the cold house, and she had sat at Odile's kitchen table for a long time in her coat, looking at the pegboard where the old woman had hung her tools and her aprons and, oddly, a single brass key on a loop of baling twine with a paper tag that said, in Odile's cramped hand, "Do not open until you need it." Junie did not know what had opened. She left it hanging. She had not come home to farm. She had come home to think, or to stop thinking, she wasn't sure which. In the city she had waited tables and taken a class or 2, and drifted the way people drift when nothing has yet reached up and grabbed them by the collar. But the farm reached up. It did it slowly. The first week she cleaned the house and patched the worst of the roof with tar paper and a borrowed ladder. The second week she walked the property line, all 80 acres, and found the old milking parlor at the back of the barn, a low stone-floored room with a drain and a window that faced east, and something in her chest went quiet and attentive when she stood in it, though she couldn't have said why. On the shelf in that room she found a row of Odil's notebooks, dozens of them, going back decades, filled with weather and dates and numbers and the occasional flat sentence like a stone dropped in a pond. Junie could not read them all at once. She started with the newest and worked backward, a page or two a night by the wood stove, and slowly a woman began to assemble herself out of the ink, a woman who had kept goats on this hillside for 50 years and had made cheese from their milk and had, at some point Junie couldn't yet locate, simply stopped. The neighbor who filled in the gaps was Odil's oldest friend, a woman named Verna Stipe, who lived down the road and drove up unannounced one afternoon in a sedan the color of a rain cloud, bringing a casserole and a great many opinions. Verna was 81 and moved slowly and spoke rarely, and when she did speak, she said the exact number of words the situation required and not one more. She wore men's work trousers and a barn coat without any self-consciousness about it, because she had earned the right to wear whatever kept her warm, and she looked at Junie across the kitchen table with pale eyes that missed nothing. "Your aunt kept goats," Verna said. Junie said she'd figured that from the notebooks. Verna nodded once. "Best cheese in 3 counties," she said. Then she got up, rinsed her coffee cup, and left, and Junie sat there a long while with the casserole cooling and the word cheese turning over in her mind like a coin she'd found in a coat she hadn't worn in years. She read faster after that. The notebooks were not sentimental. Odile had recorded which does milked long and which dried up early, which kids lived and which didn't, the exact temperature of the parlor on the morning of each making, and the exact number of days each wheel had aged in the cellar under the house. And running through all of it, page after page, was a preoccupation Junie didn't understand at first, a set of observations about the goats themselves that had nothing to do with how much milk they gave. Odile wrote about their feet, about which animals could work the steep ground and which stayed low, about which of them ate the woody brush along the fence lines and the bitter weeds in the dry places, and which turned their noses up and waited for hay. She had a phrase she used, underlined twice on more than one page. "The ones that eat the hard country," she wrote, "make the milk that carries the salt." Junie did not know what that meant. She wrote it on a fresh page in a notebook of her own, because she had already started keeping one, and she left it there like the key on the pegboard, waiting. It was Verna who mentioned the auction. She came up a second time in late March, sat in the same chair, and said the Protter man had a pen of goats he was going to send to slaughter Saturday because he couldn't feed them through the drought. Odile would have looked at him, Verna said. Junie asked what she meant. Verna considered the question for a while, the way she considered everything, and then she said, "Your aunt bought the culls, the ones nobody else would touch." She said it flat, as a fact offered for consideration, and then she finished her coffee and left, and Junie sat with it. And on Saturday morning she drove the dying truck down to the Kettle Creek stockyard and stood at the back rail and looked at 41 goats nobody wanted, and read them the way she'd learned to read the notebooks, and raised her hand. Getting them home took 2 trips and most of the day, the truck bed groaning, the animals too weak to make much trouble. She backed up to the barn as the light went orange over the ridge and let the tailgate down and stood there while they picked their way out onto the ground, 41 of them, blinking in the last of the day. She had bought hay on credit from the co-op, the last favor Odile's name would buy her, and she'd cleaned out the old parlor and bedded the barn deep with straw, and she had read enough of the notebooks by then to know she was in over her head. She had never milked anything. She had never made cheese. She had 41 animals that a whole stockyard full of men had agreed were worth less than a cup of coffee, and she had $4 less in her pocket than she'd had that morning, and she had a leaning barn and a spring that ran clean, and a phrase she didn't understand about salt and hard country. She stood in the doorway and watched the goats find the water trough and the hay. and she did not name them, because she had read in the notebooks that Odile did not name the one she wasn't sure would live. She held that line. She almost held that line. There was one, a small dun-colored doe with a crooked ear, who had leaned against the rail at the auction and who now leaned against Junie's leg in the doorway. And Junie found herself calling her crooked before she'd decided to. And after that, the line was gone, and she stopped pretending she'd ever meant to keep it. The first weeks were a war of attrition against the Drought's leftover damage. Some of the 41 were beyond saving, and Junie learned the hard grammar of that in the cold gray mornings, learned to dig on the steep ground and to say the plain words over the small graves and to keep going. But most of them, more than she had any right to expect, began to turn. It was not dramatic. It was a war won by ounces. She followed Odile's notebooks like scripture, mixing the feed the way the old woman had, adding the mineral supplement Odile had underlined, turning the animals out onto the driest, steepest, brushiest part of the property in the mornings, because the notebook said the hard country was where they belonged. And here Junie noticed the thing that would change everything, though she didn't know it yet. The goats that had looked the worst at the auction, the ribbiest and the most stubborn, were the ones that took to the brush. They climbed. They stripped the woody stems and the bitter weeds off the dry hillside with a relish the others didn't share. The ones that eat the hard country, she read again, by lamplight, and looked out the window toward the black shape of the ridge where those goats were bedded down, and something began to click into a place she couldn't yet name. By late April, the survivors, 33 of them, had coats that shone and eyes that were bright, and 11 of the does were in milk, and Junie learned to milk by watching a video on her phone with the signal cutting in and out, and then by simply doing it, badly, then less badly, then well, her hands finding the rhythm the way hands do. The parlor filled with the sweet grassy smell of warm milk in the cool of the mornings. She had no idea what to do with it. She drank some and gave some to the barn cats and poured, in those early clumsy weeks, more of it down the drain than she wanted to admit. And then one evening, deep in a notebook from 30 years back, she found the making. Odile had written it all down, every step, the temperatures and the timings, and the little sketch of the cellar shelves, and the note about the cave, which Junie did not understand, because she had seen no cave. The recipe was plain and exact, and ended with a sentence that made Junie set the notebook down and sit very still. The salt does the work, Odile had written, but the salt only works if the milk already carries it. Feed them the hard country. The rest is patience. And under that, in the same cramped hand, the words that would sit in Junie's mind for the next 2 years, like a stone in a shoe. Tell no one until it's ready. Let the cheese do the talking. She made her first batch in the first week of May, following the notebook step by step, and it was a failure. And so was the second and the third split, in a way the notebook hadn't warned her about, and she wrote down what she'd done wrong each time in her own notebook, building her own record beside Odile's, a daughter's ledger set against a mother's. But the fourth batch held. She pressed it and salted it and carried it down the cellar stairs under the house, and it was there, standing in the low stone dark, with a wheel of her own cheese in her hands, that she found the door. It was set into the back wall of the cellar, a heavy plank door she'd assumed was a closet, and it was locked, and the lock was old and brass, and Junie went back up the stairs 2 at a time and took the key off the pegboard, the one with the tag that said, "Do not open until you need it." And she stood in front of the door for a long moment with the key in her hand, because she understood suddenly that she needed it. The key turned. The door swung in on cold air that smelled of stone and earth and something older, and beyond it was not a closet. It was a passage cut back into the hillside itself, a low tunnel that opened after 20 feet into a room, a true cave, cool and dim and still, its walls furred with a fine pale bloom, with wooden shelves built into the rock, and on the shelves, in rows going soft and gray with age, the last cheeses Odile Halloran had ever made, waiting all these years for somebody to come and understand them. Junie stood in the cave a long time. The air was 52 degrees, she would learn later, and never varied, winter or summer, drought or flood, because it was the breath of the hillside, and the hillside kept its own counsel. The old wheels on the shelves were long past eaten, but they told her everything she needed to know. This was where the cheese was supposed to go, not the cellar, here. The notebooks had said cave, and she had thought it a fancy, and it had been literal all along, a room her great-aunt had used for 50 years, and her great-grandfather before her, cut into the same limestone that filtered the spring that ran clean when every other well in the valley failed. Junie set her one good wheel on an empty shelf, alone in the middle of all that history, and she went back up and locked the door behind her. And that night she wrote in her notebook, in a hand not quite steady, that she had found where the salt does its work, and that she would be patient, and that she would tell no one until it was ready. That was the spring. The summer she spent learning the cave the way she'd learned the milking, by attention and repetition and failure. She made cheese twice a week and carried each wheel down into the hill and turned them on their shelves and rubbed their rinds and watched the pale bloom take hold and spread. And she learned that some wheels wanted 6 weeks and some wanted 6 months, and that the only way to know was to cut one open, which meant sacrificing it, which she did, again and again, tasting and writing and tasting and writing. And slowly the cheese got better. It got better than the video, and better than the co-op cheese in its plastic, and she began to suspect somewhere in July, better than anything she had ever eaten in her life, though she distrusted her own judgment and told herself she was biased. The valley did not know any of this. The valley knew only that the Halloran girl had bought a pen of dying goats for $4 and was rattling around alone up on Sorrel Road, and when Junie went to town for supplies, the men at the feed store watched her with the mild, unbothered curiosity of people waiting to be proven right. Warren Coyle asked her once, at the register, how her livestock investment was performing, and let the word investment hang in the air so the others could enjoy it. Junie said the goats were fine. Coyle said he was glad to hear it, in the tone of a man who was not. That's one approach, Junie said, though he hadn't proposed one, and she paid for her salt and left, and Coyle told the others she was a strange one, and the others agreed. She did not sell a single wheel that first summer. This was the part that the men, had they known, would have found most damning, and it was the part Junie was most certain about. The notebook said, "Let the cheese do the talking," and the cheese was not ready to talk. So she waited. She lived on almost nothing, on eggs from the hens she'd bought, and vegetables from the garden she'd put in, and the last of Odile's canned goods in the cellar. And she paid down the hay debt in small installments that made the co-op manager raise his eyebrows, and she kept the goats on the hard country, up on the brushy ridge, morning after morning. Because the notebooks were unambiguous on that point, and because she had begun to believe them the way you come to believe a thing you have tested with your own hands. By August she had 33 healthy animals and 14 in milk, and a cave with 40 wheels of cheese, aging in the cool dark at the heart of the hill. And she had told no one. And she had $4 less than she'd started the year with, and she had never been more certain of anything. The first sale happened by accident in October, which is how the notebook said the best things happened. Verna Stipe came up the road in her rain-cloud sedan, as she did every few weeks, and this time Junie, on impulse, cut a wedge from a wheel she'd decided was ready and set it on a plate with some of Odile's apple butter and put it in front of the old woman without a word. Verna looked at it, then she looked at Junie. Then she picked up the wedge and ate it slowly, the way she did everything, and when she was done she set the rest of it down and was quiet for a length of time that Junie found unbearable. "Odile's," Verna finally said. It was not quite a question. Junie said she'd use the notebooks. Verna nodded slowly, and then she said the most words Junie had ever heard her string together at once. Better, she said. She was getting old at the end. Her hands got tired. This is what she was reaching for. She said it flat, without ceremony, and then she wrapped the rest of the wedge in her handkerchief and put it in her coat pocket and said she'd pay for it, and Junie said she couldn't take money from her, and Verna said, in a tone that ended the discussion, that a thing given away is a thing nobody values, and put $4 on the table, which Junie recognized, and Verna recognized, and neither of them mentioned, was the price of 41 goats. Verna took that wedge to church. She was not a woman who explained herself, so she simply set it out at the fellowship hour after the Sunday service with a knife beside it and let people find it. And by the following TU's Day, 3 different women had called the Halloran farm, asking whether the girl up on Sorrel Road was selling cheese, and one of them was the wife of the man who owned the diner in Kettle Creek, and she wanted to know whether Junie could bring some by for her husband to taste. Junie drove down with 2 wheels wrapped in cloth in a cooler on the seat beside her, the truck composing a new movement of its obituary the whole way, and she set them on the counter of the Ridgeline Diner and waited while the owner, a heavy-set man named Sib Fancher, who had cooked in that kitchen for 30 years, cut a slice and ate it standing up with his apron still on. He chewed. He stopped. He cut another slice. He asked her what she'd fed the goats, and Junie said the hard country, the brush, and the bitter weeds up on the dry ridge, and Sib Fancher nodded slowly as if that explained something he'd been trying to figure out his whole career, and he said the cheese tasted like the hillside, like there was a place inside it, and Junie said that was the salt, that the salt only worked if the milk already carried it, and she was quoting Odile without meaning to, and Sib said he'd take everything she had. He couldn't take everything she had, because Junie wouldn't sell it all at once, and this became the shape of the thing. She sold Sib Fancher what was ready and no more, and she kept the rest aging in the cave, and she raised her prices twice that winter, not out of greed, but because Verna told her flatly that cheap cheese was assumed to be cheap for a reason, and the diner sold it faster the more it cost, which was a lesson Junie wrote in her notebook and underlined. Sib put it on the menu as a plate with apple butter and toasted bread, and he called it, on the little chalkboard by the register, Drought cheese, because that was what people had started calling it. The cheese made from the goats nobody wanted, from the dry ridge, in the 2 years the rain didn't come. People drove in from the next county to try it. A food writer from the city came through in February, tasted the plate, tracked Junie down, and wrote 300 words about a young woman making extraordinary cheese from rescued animals in a cave in a hillside. And after that the phone rang more than Junie could answer, and she took to letting it go and calling people back in the evenings, in the order they'd called, because she would not be rushed and because the cave held only so much and the goats gave only so much milk, and there was no arguing with either of those facts. She did not expand. This was the thing the valley could not understand, and the thing Junie was most stubborn about. Men came up the road with propositions now, men who had watched her buy the dying goats and had said she'd overpaid, and they had opinions about scaling up and taking on more animals and building a proper facility with stainless steel and a loan to pay for it. And Junie listened to all of them with her hands in her jacket pockets and then said some version of the same thing, which was that she'd let them know how it went. She added animals only when the pasture in the cave could carry them, a few does a year, born on the place and raised on the hard country from the start. She turned down a distributor from 3 states over who wanted a standing weekly order of 100 wheels because she made 40. And she wrote in her notebook that night that the demand could pull the growth or the debt could push it, and that she would let it pull slowly, the way the cave took its time, the way the hillside kept its own counsel. Verna, when Junie told her about the distributor, nodded once and said, "Good." And that was the whole of her congratulation, and it was enough. Warren Coyle came up the road in April, 2 years and a month after the auction. He came alone, in the middle of the afternoon, and he sat in his truck for a minute before he got out. And Junie watched him from the barn and knew what it was before he said a word, because there is a particular way a proud man stands when he has come to say a thing he does not enjoy saying. He walked up and looked at the goats on the ridge, 38 of them now, fat and shining and working the brush, and he looked at the barn that still leaned its degree or two off true, and he took off his cap. "I bought a plate of your cheese at Sib's," he said. Junie waited. Coyle turned his cap in his hands. "I was one of the ones laughing at the sale," he said. "I recall telling you that you'd overpaid." Junie said she recalled it too. Coyle nodded and looked at the ridge again and said, "I was wrong about it, that was all." He did not make a large production out of it. He did not apologize in so many words, because men like Warren Coyle apologize by admitting the fact and letting it stand, and Junie understood that, and she let it stand. Then Coyle said he had 40 acres adjoining her east line, good brushy hillside going to waste since he'd sold his cattle, and that if she ever wanted to lease it for the goats at a fair price, the offer was there. He said it plainly, a fact offered for consideration, and Junie said she'd think on it, which was not a no, and both of them knew it. And Coyle put his cap back on and drove off, and Junie stood in the yard a long time afterward, not triumphant, just quiet. The way you are quiet when a thing you always knew has finally been said out loud by someone who fought it. The valley turned the way Coyle turned, one person at a time, without ceremony. The feed store started stocking the mineral supplement Odile had used because the Halloran girl bought it, and now other people wanted to try what she was doing. The gas station clerk, a talkative young man named Petey who knew everything that happened within 20 miles, took to telling every traveler who stopped for fuel about the cheese made in the cave, and half of them drove up Sorrel Road to see, and Junie put a hand-lettered sign at the end of her lane, "Sold out most days, come Saturday," because she would only sell in person and only what was ready, and the scarcity of it became part of the thing, though she never planned it that way. A chef from a restaurant in the city, a cousin of Sib Fancher's as it turned out, drove up one Saturday in a car worth more than the farm and bought his allotment and stood in the yard eating a wedge of it out of the paper and told Junie it was the best cheese being made in the state. And Junie thanked him and said she'd let him know when there was more. And the chef laughed and said he'd never been told to wait for cheese before. And Junie said the cave set the pace, not her. And the chef stopped laughing and looked at her and said he understood, and she believed that he did. She hired the first help that summer, a 15-year-old named Marla from down the road whose family had fallen on hard times and who wanted work, and Junie taught her the milking and the feeding and, slowly, the making, because Junie had begun to think, without wanting to, about what the notebooks were for. They were not only Odile's record, they were a chain, going back, and Junie was a link in it now, and links are meant to hold something to what comes after. She taught Marla the way Odile's notebooks had taught her, by showing and repeating and letting her fail and writing down the failures. And Marla had good hands and a stubborn streak and stopped being afraid of the goats after the first week, and Junie caught herself thinking that the girl reminded her of somebody, and understood after a moment that the somebody was herself 2 summers back, standing at the back rail of the stockyard reading the animals nobody else could read. Verna Stipe died in September, in her sleep, in the house down the road, 83 years old. Junie found out from Petey at the gas station, who told her gently, because even Petey knew when to be gentle. She drove down and sat with the family, and did what there was to do, and afterward, in the empty week that follows a death, she went into the cave alone and stood among the shelves and thought about the old woman who had eaten that first wedge slowly and said better, and had taken it to church without being asked, and had put $4 on the kitchen table because a thing given away is a thing nobody values. It was Verna who had started it all, Junie understood now, standing in the cool dark, not with a plan, with a wedge of cheese and a knife and a fellowship hour and 80 years of knowing exactly how the valley worked. Junie had thought the cave was the thing her great-aunt left her, and the goats, and the notebooks, but Verna had left her something too, and it was the whole of the audience, the network of women and diners and gas stations and Sunday tables that had carried the word from mouth to mouth the way word had always traveled here, without marketing, without a single dollar spent on persuasion, because the cheese did the talking and the valley did the rest. Junie cut a wheel that day, one she'd been aging 8 months, the best she had ever made, and she took a wedge of it down to the funeral and set it out at the reception with a knife beside it. And she did not explain herself either, because she had learned that too, and the people who understood, understood. She leased Warren Coyle's 40 acres in the 3rd year, and she added a dozen animals to work the new ground, and she did it the same way she had done everything, slowly, out of the money the cheese had made, without a loan, without stainless steel, without a distributor's 100 wheels a week. The barn still leaned. She fixed the roof properly and shored up the parlor floor and built new shelves in the cave. Deeper into the hill, where the stone opened into a second room, she and Marla found one afternoon with a lantern following the cool air. And there was room in it for years of cheese, decades of it. And Junie stood in that further dark and thought about her great-grandfather cutting the first passage into the limestone, a man she had never met, a man who had understood before anyone that the hillside kept a constant breath and that the breath would do the work if you gave it time. Inherited, unspoken, written down in a cramped hand and locked behind a brass door with a tag that said, "Do not open until you need it." She had needed it. She had opened it. And the thing the valley had dismissed as worthless ground and worthless animals, and a strange girl's foolishness, had turned out to be the most valuable thing in 3 counties. Not because anyone argued it, but because reality is patient and always wins in the end, if you let it. The 4th year, a full 4 years after the morning of the auction, a stockyard sold a pen of drought-thin goats that nobody wanted, and Junie Halloran heard about it from Petey at the gas station, and she drove down to Kettle Creek on a cool, bright morning and stood at the back rail of the yard in a canvas jacket that fit her now, and looked at the animals nobody else could read. There were 19 of them this time, ribby and dull-coated and leaning on the rails, and the men on the top rail had already written them off, and the auctioneer opened at $1 and let the silence sit. Junie raised her hand. This time nobody laughed. This time a man she didn't recognize leaned over to the man beside him and said, "That's the cheese girl." And the second man nodded, and there was a different quality to the quiet, a watchfulness because the valley had learned that when the Halloran girl raised her hand over a pen of animals nobody wanted, it meant something, though they still couldn't have said exactly what. She bought the 19. She paid more than $4 this time, because there was competition now, a young man from over the ridge who'd heard what she'd built and wanted to try it himself, and Junie was glad of him, and outbid him gently, and afterward found him in the parking lot and gave him her number and told him to call, that she'd show him the making, that the hard country was bigger than one farm, and there was room in it for anybody willing to be patient. She loaded the 19 goats into a trailer she owned now, hitched to a truck that ran, and drove them up Sorrel Road to the leaning barn and the clean spring and the cave in the heart of the hill. And she let the tailgate down in the orange evening light and stood in the doorway and watched them pick their way out onto the ground. 19 of them, blinking, finding the water and the hay, finding, though they didn't know it yet, the place where the drought, thin and the rejected, and the ones that ate the hard country made the milk that carried the salt. A small dun doe with a crooked ear, an old one now, the very first, came and leaned against Junie's leg in the doorway, and Junie put a hand on her rough, warm back and stood there a while as the light went down behind the ridge where the goats worked the brush, and she did not say anything, because there was no one to say it to and nothing that needed saying, and the cheese, aging in the dark behind its brass door, was doing all the talking that was required. If this story reached you, If any part of it landed where you needed it to, do one thing for me before you go. Send it to someone you know who has been told that what they have isn't worth much, someone with a piece of ground or a skill or a dream that the people around them have looked at and laughed at and priced at $4. Somebody needs to hear tonight that the overlooked thing is often the most valuable thing once somebody takes the time to understand it, and that patience and attention will beat capital and force and conventional wisdom given long enough, and that the past has a way of speaking to the present if we only keep the notebooks and turn the key when we need it. And then leave me a comment. Tell me about the thing in your own life that people said would come to nothing. Tell me what you've been quietly building while the men on the top rail waited to be proven right. And tell me where you're watching from, your town, your city, the hillside, or the flatland, or the far side of the world, because I read every single comment, every one, and I sit with them the way Junie sat with the notebooks, a page or two a night by the wood stove, and I am glad, more than I can say, to know you're out there, listening in the quiet, feeding the hard country, waiting for the cheese to be ready. It will be. Give it time. The winter that followed was the coldest the valley had seen in a decade, and it settled over Sorrel Road like a held breath. The drought had broken at last that autumn, the rains coming steady and gray, and the men at the feed store who had spent 2 years complaining about the dry now complained about the wet, because complaint was the language they spoke, and the weather was only ever the vocabulary. But Junie welcomed it. The spring ran higher and clearer than ever, and the ridge greened up in patches even under the frost, and the cave held its 52 degrees the way it always had, indifferent to the rain or the snow or the arguments of men, keeping its own counsel in the dark. She and Marla worked the mornings with their breath showing white in the parlor, and the 19 new goats came through the cold the way the first 41 had, by ounces, by attention, by the hard country that made them stubborn enough to live. It was in February, on a night the wind came down off the ridge and rattled the windows of the farmhouse, that Junie sat at Odil's kitchen table with the oldest of the notebooks open before her, the one she had saved for last, the one from the very beginning of her great-aunt's keeping. She had been afraid of it in a way she couldn't name, the way you are afraid of the first page of a thing you know will end. The ink was faded almost to nothing, and the hand was younger, less certain, a woman still learning what Junie had spent 4 years learning. And near the front, tucked between 2 pages, she found a folded sheet that was not Odil's at all. It was older still, the paper gone soft and brown at the folds, and the hand on it was a man's, cramped and slanting, and at the top it said, in letters Junie had to hold to the lamp to read, for whoever comes after. She read it 3 times before she let herself believe it. It was her great-grandfather's, the man who had cut the cave. And it was not instructions, and it was not a recipe. It was a kind of letter written to no one he would ever meet, to whatever hands would someday turn the brass key. "This ground is poor," he had written. "They told me so when I bought it, and they were right, if you measure ground the way they measure it. But there is a spring that never fails, and a hillside that grows the bitter brush the goats want, and there is limestone under the whole of it that keeps a cool breath year-round. I have cut a room into that breath. What the valley calls worthless, I have found, is only worth that no one has taken the trouble to understand. I will not live to see what this becomes, but I have written it down, because a thing understood and written down is a thing that does not die when the man who understood it dies. Feed them the hard country. Let the cave do the work. Tell no one until it is ready, and when it is ready, do not sell it cheap, and do not sell it fast, and do not let anyone rush you, because the hillside will not be rushed, and neither should you." Junie set the letter down on the table beside the notebook, and she sat for a long while in the lamplight with the wind at the windows, and she understood at last the whole length of the change she was a link in, 4 generations of it, one hand right into the next across the years, each of them saying the same plain thing in slightly different words, none of them ever raising their voice, all of them right. She copied the letter into her own notebook that night, word for word. So there would be 2 of it now, and she added a line of her own at the bottom because it seemed to her that the letter was not finished, that it was the kind of thing each keeper was meant to add to and pass along. I came back not because I had a plan, she wrote. I came back because there was nowhere else that was mine. I bought 41 goats for $4 because nobody else would look at them long enough to see what they were. The valley laughed. The valley came around. It always does. If you let reality do the arguing. Tell no one until it's ready. Let the cheese do the talking. And when your hands get tired, teach somebody with good hands and a stubborn streak and give them the notebooks and show them the key. She read it back once, and it seemed true, and she closed the notebook and set it on the shelf in the parlor beside all of Odil's, where the next one would find it. In the morning the wind had died, and the snow lay clean and blue on the ridge, and Junie walked out with Marla to turn the goats onto the brush, and the animals came off the barn floor eager and shining, the old dun doe with the crooked ear leading the way she always did, up the hard country she had eaten her whole life. Junie stood at the fence and watched them climb, and she thought about her great-grandfather standing at this same fence a lifetime ago, looking at ground the valley had priced at nothing, seeing what it could be. She thought about telling Marla about the letter, and decided the girl wasn't ready, not yet, that there was time, that the notebooks would still be on the shelf when Marla's hands were sure enough to need them. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. You did not hand a person the whole chain at once. You gave them the milking, and then the making, and then, someday, when they had earned it the way Verna had said a thing must be earned, you gave them the key. Junie leaned on the fence in the cold, bright morning and watched the goats work the hillside. And behind her, under the hill, in the dark that never changed, 4 generations of patience were slowly, quietly, turning into something the whole valley would drive up Sorrel Road to taste, and none of it needed saying, so she said nothing at all.